Greg Mourad, hope I'm pronouncing that right, from the National Right to Work Committee. Speaking in favor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Greg Mourad. I am Vice President of the National Right to Work Committee, a 2.8 million member citizens organization dedicated to the elimination of compulsory unionism across the country. On behalf of our more than 40,000 members in Wisconsin, I thank the chairman and the members of this committee for taking the time today to examine the right to work issue, which would simply guarantee working men and women in Wisconsin the right to decide for themselves whether a labor organization deserves their financial support. I am here today on behalf of our Wisconsin members, a couple of thousand of whom have signed a petition that we delivered via email to your staff, Mr. Chairman, earlier today. If you were to ask around, you would probably find that most folks do know that right to work brings more jobs and a better economy. Most people know that forcing anyone to bankroll an organization against their will just to keep their job is wrong. It's also not hard to see how forced unionism breeds corruption and abuse. But because of their complexity, federal and state labor laws are not well understood by most citizens. I'd like to open my testimony with a simple illustration that highlights the principle upon which current national and Wisconsin labor law rests. Imagine yourself standing outside this building today at the end of this hearing when a cab pulls up. Two guys grab you, pull you into the cab with them, and the driver announces this cab is on its way to Milwaukee. You protest that you're just trying to go to dinner, but the other two passengers will not let you out. The driver also ignores your protests. So after a lengthy drive, they finally pull over, the car stops, they let you out, but before they let you go, the driver demands $100 for your share of the cab fee. You've got to be kidding, you say. You forced me to go with you. I had nothing to say about this. But you don't understand, they tell you. We had a vote, and the majority rules. And unless you pay your share of the ride, you're a free rider. You've gotten a benefit, a trip to Milwaukee. We have every right to make you pay. But I didn't want to go to Milwaukee. I'm a kidnap victim. In a nutshell, I have just illustrated how federal and state labor laws abuse the freedom of working men and women to earn an honest living for themselves and their families. If this taxi ride were to happen for real, the other passengers and the driver of the taxi would be arrested for kidnapping and extortion. Forced unionism makes no more sense. This example also illustrates the absurdity of the false analogy we've heard several times today that because 51% of a workforce wants a union, that union should somehow have the same sort of claim on people's money that the government does in taxes. It's absurd. If 51% of my neighbors want to build a neighborhood gym, can they force me to buy a membership in the gym and run on their treadmills instead of on the street? If 51% of my neighbors want to set up a gourmet club, should I have to pay dues to their gourmet club in order to cook dinner for my family instead of eating out? Unions are not the government. They are a private organization. Under current law in Wisconsin, employees who never requested union membership can be forced to accept a labor union as their exclusive monopoly bargaining agent and be forced to work within the union's monopoly negotiated contract. Then, compounding the injury, they can be forced to pay for representation they never requested and do not want. You see, Big Labor's whole intellectual house of cards is built on two myths that they desperately want you to believe. Neither myth is true. Despite what you have heard this morning and will continue to hear from Wisconsin's union leaders and members, federal law does not require them to represent all workers. Unions are perfectly free under federal law to negotiate a contract that only sets the terms and conditions of employment for their own voluntary members. Indeed, this practice was common in the first several years after the adoption of the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. But a monopoly is a powerful thing. That is why we regulate it through most sectors of the economy and don't allow it. That's why instead of exercising this perfectly legitimate members-only bargaining option, today's union leaders consistently take advantage of the provisions of federal law that give them the tyrannical power to force every worker to submit to their monopoly bargaining, what the law euphemistically calls exclusive representation. By exercising this power, they forbid individual workers to represent themselves. That is when the duty of fair representation kicks in, after the union's decision to impose its monopoly. Then these same union officials turn around and falsely complain that stripping away these workers' right to self-representation has somehow become a burden to the union, entitling them to forced dues. This is the most brazen hypocrisy you will ever find anywhere in American politics. The other myth that Big Labor would like you to believe is that the union contract actually benefits all workers. Again, nothing could be further from the truth. Contracts that base pay entirely on seniority work against a new employee who would love to work harder, longer, or smarter and be rewarded for it. He cannot. And no matter how much better he works, he will be the first one fired. Contracts that trade away wages in favor of gold-plated health insurance plans work to the advantage of older employees and against young, healthy employees who never visit doctors and would rather have a simple health plan and a couple of extra dollars an hour. Union contracts regularly hold back the most productive workers, and prominent pro-union theorists freely admit this fact. Richard Rothstein, a research associate at the union-backed EPI, Economic Policy Institute, commented that, quote, in unionized firms, wages of lower-paid workers are raised above the market rate, with the increase offset in part by reducing the pay of the most productive workers. And Harvard economist Richard Freeman, one of the leading academic apologists for forced unionism, actually praised big labor for, quote, removing performance judgments as a factor in determining individual workers' pay. So don't be fooled. Independent-minded workers are being forced to accept a union as their bargaining agent and are being forced to work under contracts that actually harm their interests. It is an outrage to force people to pay for this so-called representation that they did not ask for, do not want, and would be better off without. Federal law that was supposedly constructed to protect workers actually contains some of the most deliberately misleading language you can imagine. Let me read the essential portion of Section 7 of the National Labor Relations Act entitled Rights of Employees. Employees shall have the right to self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, and to bargain collectively through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other concerted activities for the purpose of collective bargaining or other mutual aid or protection, and shall also have the right to refrain from any or all such activities. Now, if it stopped there, that'd be great. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. Employees shall have the right to refrain except to the extent that such right might be affected by an agreement requiring union membership as a condition of employment. That except, in the words that follow, have to be one of the most cynical exercises in legislative deception on record. Fortunately, since 1947, federal law has allowed states to remove that exception, giving us a right to work status. That is why we're here today, and I urge you to use this provision in federal law to protect the workers of Wisconsin by passing the Wisconsin Right to Work Act. The underlying philosophy of those who believe in the right to work principle can best be summed up by the words of Samuel Gompers, founder of the American Federation of Labor, who urged, and I quote, devotion to the fundamentals of human liberty, the principles of voluntarism. No lasting gain has ever come from compulsion. If we seek to force, we but tear apart that which united is invincible. And Gary Castile was making the same point in the quote that you cited earlier, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mourad. That ends the 7 minutes that we have.